Moving on now, the 12th Conference on Climate Change and Development in Africa has kicked off today in Côte d'Ivoire's capital, Abidjan. Now, despite Africa's limited contribution to climate change, the continent is disproportionately affected by it. Currently, 17 out of the 20 nations most threatened by climate change are located on the continent. Now, across Africa, climate change already impacts 2 to 9% of national budgets. Let's get some more insight into all these with James Murombedzi. He is a climate and resource governance specialist with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Great to have you with us on the show today, sir. Now, of course, let's start off with the fact that climate experts are saying that the trends are showing that there has been an intensification and an acceleration of the challenges posed by climate change, particularly here in Africa, which, of course, is more vulnerable than the rest of the world. Give us some insight into that growing urgency of the climate situation, especially for Africa.
Yes, thank you for having me. So the climate crisis is certainly accelerating and intensifying, and it is also multi-dimensional, and the accelerations are happening across all dimensions of climate impacts. So we have an increase in extreme weather events, but you also have an increase and intensification in slow onset climate-related events, such as biodiversity loss, such as land degradation, which all have significant impacts, including, for instance, forcing people off of the land, forcing people into migration, which have negative impacts on infrastructure, which have negative impacts on health, and a whole range of issues. And Africa certainly is more impacted than other continents for a variety of reasons, but particularly because the continent has limited capacity to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And these capacities to adapt to climate change are actually further exacerbated by the absence of financing for climate actions, by the impacts of the debt burden that the continent is facing, as well as by the diversion of available resources to other causes, such as, for instance, the impact of the recent COVID-19 pandemic and so on. And at the same time, the continent is utilizing a lot of its own resources. As you said, 2 to 9% of African GDP is now being diverted to finance adaptation to climate change. Right. These are adaptation actions which are necessary, but which are difficult to predict and to budget for. And recall, this is funds that are not available in the first place. And so, for instance, we have adaptation now costing up to 5 times more in African budgets than what is paid to health and education. So climate change is becoming a huge cost to the continent's economies, in addition to the impact that climate change has on ecosystems and on societies.
And on that note, with the situation becoming critical, I'd like us to take stock of the progress made so far in terms of mitigation, adaptation, and so forth, because we know the implementation of measures provided for in the Paris Agreement, they fell short of their intended outcomes. We're told there was a course correction, which we saw parties contributing more to the global effort to transition away from fossil fuels, of course, across energy systems over this decade. Now, with the next round of contributions, these contributions expected next year, that's in 2025, give us a sense of how Africa is progressing so far on issues such as those nationally determined contributions and, of course, mitigation and adaptation.
We do know that we are not on course to achieve most of the objectives and goals of the Paris Agreement. And we know this through the outcomes of the global stocktake, which was concluded at COP28 in Dubai. In terms of the cost correction, the global stocktake actually calls for more resources to be made available to support climate actions. That is, more climate finance, more means of implementation in terms of technology transfer, capacity building, and so on. But it also calls for rapid transition away from fossil fuels in order to mitigate the impacts of climate change. But you must understand that Africa's priority is not mitigation. Africa is contributing less than 4% of current global emissions and much less in terms of historical emissions. The priority for the continent is to adapt to the impacts of already occurring climate change. And this adaptation is reflected in very ambitious nationally determined contributions that have been proposed by African countries, both in the first round and that are now being proposed in response to the outcomes of the global stocktake. So there's a contradiction there. You have a continent that is actually contributing the least and yet is the most ambitious in terms of trying to halt the impacts of climate change and to adapt to the impacts of the already occurring climate change. So in terms of course correcting regarding accessing the resources that are required to support climate action, the continent has also come up with very significant proposals. Negotiation, and which will continue to be discussed at the next conference of parties. But of particular concern is one of the biggest shortages in climate finance. The proposal is that a new quantified goal on climate finance should be negotiated. And this has become very complicated because there is little agreement between the parties to the Paris Agreement on what that goal should be. The objective is to try and agree on climate finance that is adequate and available to meet actual needs of climate finance. And that goes way beyond the $100 billion a year, which was proposed many years ago in Copenhagen, 2009, and which has actually never been fully delivered to this day. So that is one of the biggest challenges that the continent is facing. There is also a negotiations around a global goal on adaptation, which is also going to look at what kind of climate actions can be supported in order to meet the adaptation needs of the continent. Again, complex negotiations are ongoing, but the African group of negotiators has developed a concrete position on all of these key issues, which will enable the achievement of the climate action goals that are proposed by the continent.
And I want to get into you with that common position for the continent. But before then, very quickly, you alluded to financing. And we know that Africa still has one of the lowest levels of access to green finance. And the lack of green investment is, of course, as you mentioned, compounded by that growing debt burden on the continent. The reality is that Africa's climate finance does need, its needs are too urgent if we're going to continue this way. Is there any hope in terms of resolving that financing obstacle?
There is hope, yes. Firstly, most of the available climate finance is actually going towards supporting climate mitigation actions. About 60%, maybe more, of climate finance is for mitigation. Now, the continent does not really have much investment in mitigation because the continent is not a major contributor to greenhouse gases. The continent needs to access climate finance for adaptation, and that is the least amount that has been made available. And of that 40% of climate finance which is available for adaptation, it is mostly going to very few countries. According to our calculations, about 10 countries, the top 10 African countries, receive more than 50% of the available adaptation finance. And that's for a variety of reasons, including the very fact that, in fact, adaptation is not normally profitable for investment, but also it is very difficult to develop proposals that are fundable and investable. But in terms of the hope that exists, the continent also possesses some of the biggest deposits, the largest known deposits of critical raw materials that are essential for the transition to renewable energy. So you have huge deposits of copper, lithium, cobalt, all of the critical materials, battery materials that are required to support renewable energy. But for these to actually constitute viable sources of resources for climate action, we also need to see changes in the relations of production, the relations of extraction of those minerals, so that the benefits are flowing to the continent. The current relations of Africa with the rest of the world is that actually Africa is a source of raw materials, including raw minerals that are extracted and exported. So what would benefit the continent is if the financing system were to be reformed in order to allow for investment in building infrastructure, capacities, technologies for the continent to process these raw materials and to trade with the rest of the world on equal terms. And this would also be helped if the debt crisis could be resolved in ways that are beneficial to the continent. And as well, we are aware that there are serious negotiations happening now around the reforming the global financial infrastructure. And that reform would benefit the continent if it were to focus on making available to Africa resources at affordable rates beyond the current, almost expropriatory rates of 15, 17% for the gas that are available. But in addition, climate finance needs to be made available as grants rather than as loans, because one of the challenges that the continent is currently facing is much of the available climate finance is actually coming in as very expensive loans, which is adding to the debt burden that the continent is facing. So if these changes were to happen, then of course there is hope that there will be adequate finance available to manage the climate response on the continent.
Now, very quickly, we know all these issues will be put on the table at this critical 12th conference on climate change and development in Africa. You say you guys are hoping to contribute to that determination of Africa's common position on climate action going forward. But what are the outcomes you are hoping to see coming out of this meeting?
So the CCDA is actually a conference which is organized by the African Union Commission, the African Development Bank, as well as the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, in support of the Africa Group of Negotiators and their position going towards the COP. This particular climate change and development in Africa, the 12th conference, is focusing on providing support on the conclusion of the global stocktake, which was presented at COP28. We are also focusing on details, facts, and data in support of the African position on the new collective quantified goal on climate change. What exactly does the continent require in terms of climate finance? We are working towards contributing data to the Africa Group of Negotiators on that. We are also hoping to have outcomes that speak to the ongoing development of the global goal on adaptation.
Right.
And then, of course, we will have conversations around the just transition to net zero. What constitutes a just transition for Africa? What types of investments are necessary for that transition to happen in a way that contributes to the development of the African continent, while at the same time addressing the climate challenge?
Right.